Let's talk about the different elements that are involved in persuasion. We're going to start out by talking about the communicator, the person who is communicating the message, who is trying to persuade the other person. Now, who is saying something does affect how an audience receives it. People tend to be more willing to agree with the statements that are made by leaders in the political party that they belong to. They did this one experiment where the Dutch Parliament, they had leaders that were socialist and liberal, and they had both leaders from the different backgrounds of different parties argue exactly the same thing with the same words, and people were more likely to accept the message when it was delivered by somebody who led their political party that they affiliated with. Now, there are a number of things that actually determine and kind of make a communicator less or more effective. One of these is credibility. Credibility is referring to a person's perception of the communicator's expertise and the trustworthiness of the message. Now, these effects tend to diminish after a month or so because individuals tend to forget where a message came from. So the impact of a non-credible person may actually correspondingly increase over time if people remember the message better than the reason for discounting it. This delayed persuasion is referred to as the sleeper effect. In other words, credibility loses some of its impact and power as time goes on because people tend to forget where the message came from. And that's problematic if the message is not credible and the person delivering it is not credible. There are a number of things that actually determine how credible somebody is considered to be. One of these is perceived expertise. One of the reasons that the scientific consensus about climate change actually fails to persuade people is because people tend to count as expert someone whose conclusions support their pre-existing values and views. Perceived expertise, it also helps to be seen as knowledgeable about the topic. Having someone else convey your expertise is more effective. So having somebody else say, oh, well, this person is an expert in this, you should listen to them, is more effective than saying, I'm an expert in this. Speaking style also has an impact. Speaking more confidently and fluently increases the credibility of a person. Speakers who stumble over their words or who use fillers, things like, I don't know, they tend to be perceived as less credible. This then leads people to question their message and makes them less likely to accept what the person is saying. And then finally, perceived trustworthiness. We're more willing to listen to a communicator we trust, and many experiments have shown this. For example, we're more likely to prefer laundry detergent when the description comes from an external consumer protection board versus a detergent company. In other words, we want somebody who's not involved in the process, somebody who's external and objective and non-biased. We're more likely to prefer that laundry detergent if we get an outside opinion versus the detergent company because we're not going to trust them. Participants who are primed with trust words were more likely to follow a communicator's message to use less tap water. And online reviews of products tend to be seen as more trustworthy if they're negative, ironically. Now, trustworthiness is also seen as higher if the audience believes that the communicator is not trying to persuade them. We've talked about reactivity, knowing that somebody is trying to impact or change you and how that actually causes somebody to say, oh no, and go the opposite direction. In one study, they actually used fake newspapers and they told individuals that scientists were trying to persuade the public and the government to try to stop climate change in one scenario. In the second scenario, they said they were simply trying to inform them about climate change. And those who were told that they were simply trying to inform them were actually more likely to commit to taking action, whereas those who were told they were trying to be persuaded were less likely to change and commit to taking action. If communicators are not seen as trustworthy, we can actually overcome people's resistance by using humor. Direct eye contact does not improve persuasion. So that's credibility. Let's talk now about attractiveness and liking. We may think that we are not impacted by the attractiveness and liking of a person, but research has found otherwise. We're actually more likely to respond to people that we like. Even a short conversation with someone is enough to increase our liking of that person and then our responsiveness to his or her influence. And our liking may actually open us up to their arguments, the central route, or may trigger a positive association when we see the product later, the peripheral route. Now, attractiveness can come in several forms. One of these is physical attractiveness. Arguments, especially emotional ones, are often more influential when they come from people we consider beautiful. Similarity. We tend to like people who are like us, and we tend to be influenced by those who are like us. So consumer-generated ads have actually been found to be more effective when the person who has created the ad is seen as similar to the participant. And then acting similarly or mimicking. Those who subtly mimic our postures are more influential. So these are some variables that are associated with the communicator, the person who's communicating the message, that may impact how persuasive the message is. Let's talk about the message content. So if we're talking specifically about reason, whether we're using reason versus emotion to try to persuade somebody, well, it's going to depend on the audience as to which one is more effective. Well-educated or analytical people tend to use the central route and respond best to logic. Uninterested people tend to use the peripheral route and thus emotion. When people's attitudes are formed mostly through the peripheral route, they're actually more persuaded by later peripheral emotional appeals. When they're formed through the central route, they're more persuaded by later information-based central route arguments. So knowing what has actually influenced a person in the past or what information they know, if it tends to be peripheral or emotion-based, using that to convince them further is the way to go. Whereas if it's been more logic-based and reason-based, using logic and reason to go further on is the most effective way to go. Let's talk about the effect of good feelings versus arousing fear. Messages can become more persuasive when they're associated with good feelings. They tend to enhance persuasion by enhancing a positive thinking and linking positive thinking with the message. People who are in a good mood tend to make more impulsive decisions. They tend to rely on more peripheral cues, whereas those who are unhappy tend to ruminate more, and they're less easily swayed by weak arguments. Fear can be effective. Fear-arousing messages can be effective at getting people to cut down on smoking, getting them to drive carefully, or to get a tetanus shot. For example, when Australia added graphic images of sick and dying smokers to cigarette packs, smoking rates fell nearly 5%. Playing on fear works best if the message causes people not only to fear the severity and the likelihood of a threatened event, but also to perceive a solution and feel capable of implementing it. In other words, fear only works if you give somebody a solution and a way out of it. Humor can also mitigate some of the negative effects of fear appeals. So that's discussing whether to use reason versus emotion to reach people. Let's talk about the context of the message now. The context of the message, especially what immediately comes before it or precedes it, can make a huge difference in how persuasive the message is. There are a number of strategies that have been used by salespeople and people who are trying to persuade others that we're going to talk about now. One of these is fear then relief. And in one experiment, they had a Confederate, somebody who was in on the experiment, approach people and say, "Haven't you lost your wallet?" Now, when the person located their wallet, the Confederate explained that she was selling Christmas cards for a charity. 40% of people bought the cards compared to the 10% who heard the appeal but did not feel the relief of finding their wallets after they thought they had lost them. So feeling the relief after feeling fear makes people more able to be influenced and persuaded. The foot in the door phenomenon has somebody do a small favor for you before asking them to do a big one. For example, in one study, they had a man walk up to people on the street, specifically females, I believe it was, and ask somebody if they would have a drink with them. Well, only 3% agreed. But if the man first asked if he could borrow a lighter or asked for directions first, the number agreeing actually increased to 15%. The smaller request and then the larger request. That's the foot in the door. Now, the first favor has to be voluntary. When people commit themselves to public behaviors and then perceive those acts to be their own doing, they come to believe more strongly in what they have done. And this is something that we've kind of mentioned already throughout the semester. Now, one variation on the foot in the door technique is the lowball technique, in which people agree to an initial request only to have the requester then change the terms on them. So for example, in one experiment, students were asked to donate $5 to a scholarship fund for poor students. They were first told that they would receive a coupon to Jamba Juice, a juice bar, if they did that, if they donated the $5. Now, if they agreed, the caller said that they had just run out of coupons. 78% said they would still be willing to donate the $5, whereas only 16% of students who heard that the coupons had gone before they had a chance to commit were willing to donate. So getting somebody to commit publicly and out loud is going to make them more likely to go along with it, even when the terms change. Let's talk about the door in the face technique now. Now, this is kind of going the opposite direction. After somebody first turns down a large request, the requester then counteroffers with a more reasonable request. And in one study, students were asked to commit to a 2-year program helping with delinquent children. Now, all of them refused because 2 years is a long commitment. But when asked to take those same children to the zoo afterwards, 56% agreed versus the 32% agreed when originally asked without being asked to do the 2-year program. So kind of taking it down a notch actually helped and made people more likely to agree. If they had refused a larger request and then were asked a smaller request, they were more likely to agree to that smaller request. What about some other variables that influence the message content and how it is perceived and taken by the audience? One of these is one-sided versus two-sided appeals. Research suggests that a message will be more persuasive if it addresses the opposition's arguments. For example, a recycling program increased participation by acknowledging that it was inconvenient for students to take cans to the first floor. They recognized, hey, I know this is requiring more work from you. I recognize that, but please do it. And then primacy versus recency. The primacy effect suggests that information that is presented early is most persuasive. For example, political candidates that are listed first on ballots tend to benefit. Brands were most likely to be remembered when ads were presented towards the beginning during the Super Bowl. Forgetting creates the recency effect, though. And if there's enough time that separates the two messages, and if the audience commits itself soon after the second message, then the recency effect is going to occur where the second message is remembered more. If the messages are back to back, primacy effect occurs. Let's talk about how it is said, the channel of communication. For persuasion to occur, there must be communication, and for communication, there has to be a channel, a way in which the message is delivered, whether it's face-to-face, in writing, on film, or in some other way. Now, whether it's an active experience or passive reception seems to make a difference. Spoken appeals are not necessarily more persuasive, but written and visual appeals are both passive and thus have hurdles to overcome. Written and visual appeals do have an effect, however. In the United States, for example, the political candidate with more money wins 91% of the time. Advertising exposure helps make an unfamiliar candidate into a familiar one, and mere exposure to unfamiliar stimuli breeds liking. Moreover, mere repetition can make things more believable. For example, the false rumors during the 2012 presidential election, things like Obama was born outside of the United States, Romney didn't pay taxes for 10 years. These false rumors resisted efforts at disconfirmation. Merely repeating a statement also increases its fluency, the ease with which we can say it, which in turn increases believability. Whatever makes for fluency, whether it's familiarity, we've heard it a lot, we're familiar with it, rhyme also makes for credibility. However, the more familiar people are with an issue, the less persuadable they are. Active experience also strengthens attitudes. When we act, we amplify the idea behind what we've done, especially when we feel responsible, which is why we have the relationship between behavior and attitudes. When behaviors come first, right, we typically change our attitudes and revise them to make sure that they go along. Experience-based attitudes are more confident, more stable, and less vulnerable to attack. thus the surge in consumer-generated ads. Consumers who have interactive experiences with brands and products are more engaged than those who simply see them or hear them. Now, what about personal versus media influence? Well, persuasion studies demonstrate that the major influence on us is not the media, but actually our contact with other people. During the 2010 midterm election, those who saw photos of their friends voting on Facebook were more likely to do so. Likewise, knocking on doors to encourage people to vote in a fall 1998 election increased those voting from 45% of those who had not been contacted to 60%. Now, we're going to talk about 3 ways that media influences others and also peers, how peers influence others. When it comes to media influence, Katz in 1957 actually observed that many of the media's effects actually operate in a 2-step flow of communication, from the media to opinion leaders to then everyone else. Now, these opinion leaders and trendsetters can be talk show hosts, doctors, teachers, scientists. The 2-step flow also influences drugs prescribed by doctors. Often a university hospital-based specialist is the opinion leader. Even children who grow up in a home without a TV are still influenced by the media via their friends. And I'm the perfect example of that. We actually did not get a TV in my home until I was 11 or 12. And yet I became obsessed with Spice Girls because my peers at school were obsessed with them, and I insisted on buying a book about them, even though I'd never seen them on TV and rarely heard them on the radio. What if we compare media? Which media is most effective? Well, studies comparing different media find that the more lifelike the medium, the more persuasive its message, from live, face-to-face, to videotaped, audio taped, and then written. However, messages are best comprehended, understood, and recorded when they are written. So if a message is hard to understand, persuasion should be greatest when it is written, because readers will be able to work through the message at their own pace. Research supports this. The TV medium encourages people to focus on peripheral cues. And then finally, the influence of adults on children. Communication flows from adults to children. But in one experiment, children who read that another child ate crackers with no description about the crackers were actually most likely to eat them versus those who heard that they were yummy or healthy, which suggests the importance of peers when it comes to persuasion and people who are similar to us. Let's talk now about the audience. Age is a factor that plays a role when determining how to persuade somebody and how persuasive they are. Social psychologists have offered 2 possible explanations for age differences in attitudes. One of these is the life cycle explanation. The life cycle explanation simply suggests that attitudes are going to change as people grow older. Right? So your attitudes that you hold now will not be the same as you grow older because age makes you change. The generational explanation suggests that attitudes actually do not change with age, that older people hold on to the attitudes they adopted when they were young, which are different attitudes than those adopted by young people today, thus a generation gap develops. Now, evidence mostly supports the generational explanation. Surveys show that attitudes of older people show less change than those of younger people, especially during the teens and early 20s when attitudes are forming and do not become stabilized until middle adulthood. Young people should thus choose their social influences carefully. Attitudes decades later may reveal that the events that shaped the adolescent and early 20s minds, we can kind of see, okay, what if we analyze later on, what actually shaped our experiences and who we are and our attitudes. Adolescent and early adulthood experiences are formative, partly because they make deep and lasting impressions. This is not to say that older adults are inflexible. Their views towards modern cultural ideas actually do shift towards approval. Finally, let's talk about what is the audience thinking, okay? The crucial aspect of the central route persuasion is not the message, but the response that it evokes in the person's mind. Knowing that someone is going to try to persuade you may make you come up with counter-arguments and be more likely to resist persuasion. So being forewarned that someone is going to persuade you is going to make you more resistant. Distraction. Distraction actually makes us less likely to counter-argue. Think about when you were a kid and you waited until your parents were busy to ask a favor from them or ask if you could do something. Political ads will use this technique. They'll use words that promote the candidate and visual images to distract us. And finally, uninvolved audiences tend to use peripheral cues. Analytical people with a high need for cognition prefer central routes, whereas those who like to conserve their mental resources are quicker to respond to peripheral cues. For example, students who were asked to imagine planning a spring break trip were more likely to focus on peripheral cues, things like the website design, if they did not have a specific destination in mind. So stimulating thinking makes strong messages more persuasive and weak messages less persuasive.